All right. Well, speaking of replacing John, the replacements.
Yes.
Coming. So
I
we're
share a
just
lot
covering-
in common with Paul Westerberg, actually. If you ever read their book,
I don't.
yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we'll
It's
see.
both.
We'll see.
Yeah.
All right. So this is their album "Let It Be." It comes in at number 27 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 5 in 1984, number 225 overall. It is their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. It's also ranked on Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 156, and the Replacements are ranked 160 of overall artist rankings in Best Ever Albums. In the opening montage, we heard "I Will Dare," and now you're going to hear a clip from "Dissatisfied."
Everything I've ever wanted. Tell me what's wrong. Look me in the eye and tell me that I'm satisfied. You're satisfied. Look me in the eye and tell me that I'm satisfied. Now are you satisfied?
All right, so little history of the Replacements here. The band's formation actually started in 1978 when Bob Stinson, who was 19 years old, bought his 11-year-old brother Tom a guitar in order to help keep him off of the streets. So being a good, solid big brother there. And in that same year, Bob met a guy named Chris Mars. And the three of them formed a band called Dog Breath. They started off playing covers of Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, and Yes, of all bands. Bob
That's
Stinson.
totally like Midwest.
Yeah, and Bob Stinson was a big Yes fan. I think he called Steve Howe his all-time favorite guitar player.
Oh wow.
Which is kind of interesting. So,
Yeah,
but they start.
There's a wonderful long ass biography of the Replacements. That's a great read that kind of goes into that. His influences. Pretty
Yeah.
awesome read. Yeah.
So the three of them, they just start playing. They don't really have a lead singer. And then Paul Westerberg was working as a janitor in a nearby facility, and he would, on his way home, walking home, he would pass by the Stinson house, where he would hear the band jamming out, and he would hide behind the bushes, I guess, and just listen to them, and was intrigued by the sounds that he heard. And eventually he kind of wandered his way in, and he basically ingratiated himself into the band and became the vocalist. And so prior to Westerberg joining the band, the group would be more focused not so much on the music but more on drugs and alcohol, which would become a running theme in the history of the Replacements.
It's understatement.
Yeah. And Westerberg actually was the one that started to help the band focus in their efforts and start to, even though he definitely partook in both of those things, he definitely helped the band focus more on playing music. And they were influenced by bands such as the Clash, the Damned, the Jam, and the Buzzcock, all bands that we have covered here on CTS. They then go on to change their name to the Impediments, but that didn't last too long because they basically did what they became pretty well known for, giving a very drunken performance, and they pissed off a lot of people, and then they got banned from the club. So in order to kind of, not have that name, be a burden for them, they changed their name then to the Replacements. Mars would later say, quote, maybe the main act doesn't show up and instead the crowd has to settle for an earful of us dirtbags. The names seem to just sit right with us, accurately describing our collective secondary social esteem. So they're just replacing other people, I guess. So they went with that. They recorded a 4-song demo and then gave it to a gentleman by the name of Peter Jesperson, who was the manager of a punk rock record store in Minneapolis, where they were located. He was also the founder of a record label called Twin Tone Records. And when Jesperson heard the first song called Raised in the City, he played it over and over again later, saying, if I'd ever had a magic moment in my life, it was popping that tape in. I didn't even get through the first song before I thought my head was going to explode. So he was immediately taken by the group and signed them to his label in 1980. And then they asked him to be their manager. So Westerberg was pretty much the main songwriter of the band, and they soon had enough to record a record, which was their debut album called "Sorry Ma, I Forgot to Take Out the Trash," which was released in August of 1981. And that album included the song "Got Something to Do," in homage to Husker Du, which was the another big band in Minneapolis, and that was the band that they kind of ended up having a friendly rivalry with. That I think we talked a little bit about that when we covered Husker Du. But Husker Du did influence them a little bit more to play faster and help them become more influenced by hardcore punk. So then they went in and they recorded a EP called Stink, and that was released in June of 1982. And so Westerberg started at that time trying to expand the sound, because they were basically doing really fast kind of punk, garage rock songs. Westerberg started writing a little bit more introspective songs, more ballady kind of things, including one called "You're Gonna Get Married." And he played the song in front of the band, and Bob said at the end of it, quote, "Save that one for your solo album, Paul. That ain't the Replacements." And Westerberg would later say that his toughest audience was actually the band itself, later saying that if it didn't rock enough, Bob would scoff at it. If it's not catchy enough, Chris won't like it. And if it's not modern enough, Tommy won't like it. So, and that's something that kind of became a theme for Westerberg as he was, writing songs, really being cognizant of how it would be received by his other band members, who all had pretty strong personalities. Actually, with the exception of Chris Mars, I think he was kind of more of the tempered member of the band. So they go on to release their second album called Hootenanny in April of 1983. And those recording sessions were challenging, as the laid-back, don't-give-a-fuck nature of the band kind of didn't rub too well with the the producer Paul Stark, who was much more meticulous. But the fan base started to expand a little bit beyond Minneapolis, and then they started to go onto a U.S. tour. And at that point, Tommy Stinson had to drop out of the 10th grade to join the tour, because he was so much younger than everybody else, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, that made me laugh that this kid, he started playing a band at 11. Yeah. So part of their tour was in support of REM. And during this tour, they did what they often did, which was just decide to play really bad sets. They kind of sometimes would purposefully just kind of do whatever they could to piss off the audience. And sometimes they would become known for, knowing that record execs or, A&R guys would be in the audience, and they would almost purposely play poorly.
Or like going on Saturday Night Live and doing the same thing.
Yeah, that would come later on. But it's interesting, because sometimes it was just because they were so drunk, and that's just where they were. They couldn't play that well, and other times they just purposefully were like, "Nah, we're just gonna mess around here." Like they were definitely much more into this for themselves. They said often that we're not doing this for you guys or for the fans or whatever. Like, if you like it, that's fine, but we're doing this for us. We're trying to have fun. We don't want to be big. Like, we like being in these, dirty clubs, drinking beer, just goofing off on stage is basically kind of what they were doing.
And most of them grew up pretty hard up, like from, I think it was really only, I think it was only Westerberg, if I remember correctly, that was like working class. The rest were pretty much like just scraping by, if I remember correctly, right? So it was kind of like escapist stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so for their next album, which is what Let It Be, as it became, they wanted to do more, just not play fast and loud. Westerberg wanted to focus more on the songwriting, not just playing fast, but kind of working on different song structures. So they incorporated newer instruments that you might have heard on here, like the piano, the 12-string guitar, the mandolin. Peter Buck was from REM was actually thought of producing this record, but that didn't end up happening. But he did end up playing the lead guitar part on the opening track, I Will Dare. And Westerberg recalled that, quote, "Playing that kind of noisy fake hardcore rock was getting us nowhere, and it wasn't a lot of fun. This was the first time I had songs that we arranged rather than just banging out riffs and giving them titles." So much more focused on this.
The name cared more.
Yes, he started. Yes, he did. I think that's probably true. The name of the album was actually a direct reference to the Beatles record of the same name. Westerberg recalled, "We were going to call it Whistler's Mammy, and then we were going to call it Stunk, And then we decided that the next song that came on the radio was going to be the album title. The next thing you know, When I Find Myself in Times of Trouble comes on the radio.
I think Stunk would be funny too, because Stink was the previous EP. So,
yeah. Stink was the EP, and that they were going to do Stunk. And then he said that the name was our way of saying that nothing is sacred, that the Beatles were just a fine rock and roll band, and we were seriously going to call the next record Let It Bleed.
Which would have been awesome, by the way.
Yeah. The more I research these guys, the more I'm like, I want to see more Westerberg interviews, because he seems like a really
they're in my
lane
guy. For sure. They're in my lane, humor-wise, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the album was successful as far as as far as Replacements albums were successful, because this is kind of another band that's very much in the lane of like a Velvet Underground or a Sex Pistols that really didn't.
Big Star is the one that always comes to mind for me.
Big Star as well. Yeah,
cousin,
these right, the bands that kind of they didn't sell very well, but they had a really rabid fan base, and the bands that they influenced became much bigger than them. But they're a very highly revered band. So I have a couple of other postscripts here, but that's basically the gist of the record. It was recorded from August of '83 to February of '84, and it was released on October 2nd of 1984. So it did take a while for it all to come together. But yeah, so here we go, the Replacements, and I think John? I think you're up first on this. I know you're a big fan. What do you tell me what you like about this record?
It's funny because we did Van Halen and the Replacements this week, like 2 of my 10 favorite bands. So it's kind of there. I mean, I grew up with the Replacements. Like I stumbled across them early in basically the record collection of a friend's. I had multiple friends who had cool brothers, right, and they had great music collections, and I remember grabbing Tim, which we're going to cover later, and that was the first Replacements album I ever listened to, and just really connect. This would have been when I was around 12, I think, and just really connecting with the fact that there's a grit to the Replacements that I immediately recognized. They sound working class to me. They have elements of bands I love, like almost like the jangly, at times, things like an REM has. But they have the point of view of almost like a romantic at times. Westerberg's a really good songwriter, and there's just something about the off-kilter nature, but the songs still being beautiful, which I've always appreciated about the Replacements. They're like an incredible pop band, but they're not clean, which I think is what I've always liked about them. They write pretty songs, but they're not clean pretty. They're pretty in their own way. Paul Westerberg also is pretty famous for not writing traditional romance songs too. He writes about romance and romantic ideas, but never in the context of platonic relationships, kind of. Like a good example is Unsatisfied, right? Like if you listen to that, it's a song that's about yearning that you could easily put in the context of a platonic a romantic relationship. I say not platonic, I apologize. A romantic relationship, but if you notice, he never specifically couches it in that. You don't know who he's telling to look him in the eyes and tell him you're satisfied. Is it a friend, a significant other? And then there's also a song called Androgynous on here, right? Yep. And he's very clever in writing very romantic, sentimental songs, but completely taking them out of committed romantic relationships or lust-driven, fleeting stuff. And I always love that about him, because you get all the romanticism, but without, once again, a formal way of addressing it.
The emotion really comes through. I find.
But do you notice it's he's writing about mundane things at times, like Tommy gets his tonsils out and Gary's got a boner, and you chuckle, and there's a very wink wink nod nod cover of Kiss, because you get the feeling that they both appreciate how ridiculous Kiss is, but also fully like Kiss and listen to Kiss, along the way. So it's it's kind of they're not playing it straight, but they're not making fun of it either. They're playing it right in the lane of what Kiss is to some degree. And even when they've got a clear Peter Buck guitar riff and I Will Dare, they still somehow make it a mat. I'm gonna use the Mats, right? That's their nickname, right? The Mats. And so it's still very much a Mats song. So I really, really enjoy this album. It's the twosome of this and Tim, which we'll cover later, is one of my favorite 1-2 combos in a band's history. It's also I'd like to point out, this is a very Gen X vibe. I think one of the first albums we've covered that kind of has that latchkey kid, nihilistic sort of disaffected. Yeah, like I care, but like I also want to make sure that you know that while I care, I'm self-protective in not caring. And it's like it's veering between those two emotions on this, right? Like either like I want to make sure you know I don't care, and then later I'm going to write this very touching song that shows I do care, but not in a way where I like, you know, put too much emotional vulnerability in specific things, right? I talk about it in the generals. It's kind of like the Bob Dylan thing, right? Where he writes these songs, but you're like, is this about you? Or is this about like just, you know, John Wesley Harding, you know, or something like that. So it's the same idea, right? And Paul Westerberg's solo career kind of functions to some degree as like Blood on the Tracks, where he gets a little bit more into the thing where you're like, oh, now we're singing a little bit about, you know, something that might be your actual relationships here, as opposed to character sketches in Bob Dylan's case, or large emotions, capital E, not, you know, specifically tied to, you know, you don't get the feeling that he's writing about specific relationships. You get the feeling that he's writing about the concept of stuff. Right. So, yep. So I really, really enjoy this album. It's always hard to review an album that you've listened to hundreds of times, and probably I've listened to this album 100 times over the years, and I know it inside out, and I really appreciate it. So I have been curious though as to what you guys would think about this, because I know that you guys have less of a established relationship with the Replacements than I think I do. So I guess, Josh, that's the lane for you.
Yeah, the Replacements I came to much later, and I think it was often hearing songs, one-off songs in like movies or you know, over the radio or like in stores or something, and then later finding out it was them. And I think for whatever reason, when I finally did listen to their albums, like I immediately liked them. And this is a band for me that the more I listen to them, the more I like them, and they rise higher and higher in my estimation, and become one of my favorite bands in the way that Big Star does, and those bands that were. It's funny, like all those bands that were really influential, but weren't popular at the time, I also like really love. It's like I discovered them later, and I also am influenced by them, or in my music choices at least. And you know, same thing as I mentioned with Husker Du last week. That's another band that like I really like more and more that I listen to them. But I knew the Replacements before I knew Husker Du, and I think I might have listened to this album before. I definitely am familiar with Tim, and this is kind of like you said, John, it's the 1-2 punch of this album and Tim is really what I love. What I love about them is kind of that crossover between being really shaggy and like punk rockish, but with Westerberg's writing and like that kind of pop punk sensibility that comes through, and kind of the way that the songs are so catchy. And you know, the opening track, I Will Dare and Androgynous, those are kind of examples of where the songcraft and the way they arrange things just really hits a sweet spot for me that is that I immediately am drawn to. And I like they also get in movies all the time, Josh.
Yes. So like they almost seem like they write. In no way did they do this, but it seems like they would almost be commissioned to write songs for scenes of movies, right?
Yeah.
Which is so funny because like in no way was that what they were going for. There's no guile to do something like that. So it's fascinating that they fit so well.
Yeah, and I guarantee you that's where I first heard them, is probably from like Can't Hardly Wait or some other kind of Gen X movie, like I don't know, Singles or something like that. I don't remember if they're on that soundtrack, but
Westerberg's on Singles. But
yeah,
I don't think.
So I think he scored it actually.
Yeah, I was about to say he was heavily involved in it.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Well, so for whatever reason, I love their guitar sound. I love the fact that they bring the piano out and they are expanding their sound. There's a chaotic nature to them. I also am like their sense of humor. The fact that they've named their album Let It Be is just kind of, so like punk rock, but also like, we don't give a fuck, but it's funny too, type of sensibility. Their song titles are funny. But I think at the end of the day, I really appreciate Paul Westerberg's writing and the music that's put on top of that. Just really works for me. I also picked up on like kind of the pain and the angst and the love and longing that comes through. I think this band really, I pick up on those emotions in this band a lot for some reason, as opposed to other bands. And I think that just gets back to kind of how they write their songs and stuff. But yeah, Big Star is kind of a big like link to me in terms of, I always kind of pair them in my mind in terms of what I'm looking for in bands and kind of what I respond to. And this is great. I know kind of their early albums are much more like Matt said, hard, fast, kind of more punk rock. And this is kind of their turn into more commerciality and,
and he has like a couple tracks that start to get there, but this is where it's a pretty significant shift.
So I can't say that I've listened to their entire discography, but I do love what I've heard, and this is a big thumbs up for me. It's going to be high on my decade end list.
Yeah, I'm more in line with Josh in terms of how I came across them. It's a song here on a mix. I think my brother put a couple of songs on just various mixes before, so I knew I Will Dare. I knew that there was I knew the Black Diamond cover on this, and it's an album that I knew that like, okay, this is the Replacements album. This is like their their best known or most highly regarded record. So I think I have heard it here and there. It's like, but I never really listened to it. So this is the first time that I really did that, and this is great. It's real, and you guys are saying very similar things, that I thought of when I was listening to it. It's just, it does a great melding of like that punk, edgy, sound quality to it. There still is that, something like, Coming Out, or Favorite Thing, which is kind of more of the fast punk, nature things, along with Westerberg's voice, which is just, I don't know how guys or vocalists can do this. Like, this is your main vocal presentation, is this raspy quasi scream. I don't know how that's a sustainable thing that you could do over multiple albums and for years and as a performance. But his voice sounds just so good. It's so raw. It's so energetic. It's passionate, and it's edgy as all get out, But then there is there's the flip side of it. There's a lot of melody here. There's sentimentality. This Unsatisfied is just that the sound of that song is just so well done. It's just, and as soon as I heard that, I'm like, this is going in the montage. This is going in the clip, because it's a perfectly crafted, like, raw song, and I loved it. I'm fascinated by this band. I did watch a documentary on them in preparation for this. They have one called Color Me Obsessed, which was, I think it was 2011. And the interesting thing about it is it's not really, there's no interviews of anybody in the band, and there's no music. None of the Replacements music's in it, I guess. But it's all, it's a variety of people. Robert Christgau's actually interviewed in it, so it's the first time I ever saw him talk, and he's very high on the Replacements, as well as a number of other artists, which the more I thought about it, I'm just thinking, these are like, and they're just totally effusive about the band. And I'm like, these are my guys. This is like Patrick Stickles from like Titus Andronicus, which I heard very well.
Yes,
that's very much in here as well. Brian Fallon from the Gaslight Anthem, huge fan. Colin Malloy from the Decemberists, which doesn't really sound like it, but it's just that's another band that I love. Craig Finn from the Old Steady, and Dave Belenko from Miraz, and I'm like, Dave Belenko's in this, And then they'll interview fans. Like, this is a guy that went to like 40. Replacement shows,
cool.
And so it's like a variety of people like that, but they all were talking so highly of them.
It's so interesting because outside of Titus Andronicus, I don't think of any of those bands having like a
similar sound.
They like elements.
I throw
of
the Gaslight Anthem,
but none of those bands I think of as being like edgy like this. They seem much more like college, like urban professional rock, whereas like nothing about the Replacements.
I don't know. There's some edge to the Hold Steady. There can be some edge to the Gaslight Anthem. Now, not as much as obviously Titus Andronicus definitely.
But this is like sniffing. This is like sniff and glue edge, whereas that's very much like I don't know, like wine and craft beer edge. You know what I'm saying? And I don't mean to be negative because I like a lot of those bands.
I'm talking just sonic. Just sounding like edgy, raw voice vocals and just
But we shouldn't discount too kind of probably the influence that Westerberg's writing had on those bands too, because I definitely see a through line of not only emotion but I don't know, thematics or trying to write. I mean, the Hold Steady seems designed to kind of create pop catchy songs in the same way that this band kind of does. So I think there is similarities, but I hear what you're saying about sounding different.
If we're gonna go with a band that I think like bridges that, it's like Modest Mouse. I think that kind of has elements of it, but like also sort of keeps a little bit of there's even like a little bit of like Flaming Lips, like in like not sonically, but the edge,
there's so much. I mean, this is definitely the sound of like you're right, John, like the Gen X kind of the alt rock, the in indie rock as well. I love the variety on here. You throw a song like Androgynous, and it's not just a piano song. It's the piano sounds like that saloon, like the old timey saloon bar piano, that's just, and the production here is very minimalistic. The song like Answering Machine, which is kind of like just, Westerberg playing on an electric guitar. And the first couple of times I listened to that, I'm like, man, it was almost hard to listen to. Like it got like, it was almost too much. But then the more I listened to it and the more I was kind of picking apart what he's doing on the guitar, I saw the more intricate nature of what was happening there and started to like it more. But there's a lot of stuff going on here. And even the cover of Black Diamond, which is something I think that they were doing because it's almost like there's a lot of tongue in cheek. It's like, we know it's not cool to like Kiss, but we really freaking like Kiss, and we're going to put them on this record. What's more punk rock than putting a Kiss song on a punk rock album? So they were sticking their noses at their thumbs out at the punk rockers.
It's like the Sex Pistols covering the Monkees. You know what I mean? It's the same kind of idea. Yeah. It's like I both like it and it represents something else,
right? Yeah. And that was very much them. There's a lot of dichotomy there. It's like I want to be vulnerable, but I don't want to be vulnerable. I want to be good, but I don't want to be good. It's like it's holding all these conflicting ideas at the same time. But as far as the album goes, man, it's just top to bottom. It's very, very strong. There's a lot of great stuff happening, and I really liked it. I know we're covering Tim, and I think that's it. But this definitely makes me want to go back. I was listening to kind of some of the older albums, and I'm interested in listening to the other ones as well. But man, it's really good. I think this is going to be a band that I'm going to want to get much more into. This is kind of like another Talking Heads for me, although I think we cover the Talking Heads more. But for a band that I know somewhat about, but now that I'm kind of learning more about them and listen to this record more intently, I'm fascinated by their whole story and who they were and what they did, and I'm going to get more into them, I think.
Well, and can I also say, like, if I'm trying to figure out, like, bands I'm trying to talk about, like, Matt, that kind of are there, the bands that, like, I was trying to say that, like, sound more to them are, like, the Lemonheads, the Gin Blossoms, like, Liz Phair, Matthew Sweet, like, people like that. That's who I feel like are the direct antecedents, like, kind of passionate, but also in a, I guess in a more gritty way, like, scraping out a living in the city, type way. Like, that's kind of where it, like, those type bands, right, are where I see the immediate influence, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an overall, to me, it's more of just an overall sound. It's like, this is where that, that indie rock, that alternative college rock, if you will. I mean, we kind of talked a little bit about that with REM, that they were kind of one of the first, this is like the first college rock album with Murmur, and this is in that similar lane, I think, like kind of an early, indicator of where music was going to go. And it was interesting in that documentary talking about the Gen X kids, because they were like, we kind of grew up listening to the baby boomers telling us about like how we the best music ever was the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and we missed out on this. And he's like, screw that, we had the Replacements, like.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. They really are the first like kind of Gen X-y sound. I know they're a little bit old for Gen X. I think they themselves, right, are slightly ahead of that era, but like they're the first band that sounds like they were listened by Gen X. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some of the early, like the hardcore and punk, also fits really nicely in that lane, and REM fits in that, and the Smiths fit in that lane too, right? A little bit, but yeah, this has like that stereotype of Gen X, like a little bit,
That's what it's got, that sound. So I'm a big thumbs up on this. I would encourage, that the documentary is a little bit, it's just like fans salivating over them and just talking about how awesome they are, which, but it's still fun to watch that stuff. I always get, a kick out of like watching people like talk about how passionate they are about a band that they just love and stuff. And it makes me more interested, if this many people like are that into them, it's just like, that's interesting to me.
There's so many bands that I learned about from the Replacements too. Like, so after the cool thing about them was like through the Replacements, I learned about like Husker Du and Soul Asylum, because you learn about the Minnesota rock scene, right? And they're there. I think they were Camper Von Beethoven was in that scene. I think they were also a Minnesota band, but like them and Cracker are another band I learned about sort of, through them. There's just so many bands that like I found out about. Urge Overkill, right, is another band that like
they're Midwestern.
Smithereens, like I'm just thinking of all the bands that like Social Distortion, right? There's another band, like just there's a lot of bands that I liked that were, if you like the Replacements, well, like and I was kind of directed to, and I guess maybe that's why I bristled a little bit, Matt, because you're right sonically that those bands take a lot from the Replacements and stuff, but like I don't know, those bands just seem like they're for college educated, upper middle class people, and they sound similar, but like they funneled it. It's like kind of like how Vampire Weekend, right? Like, who I like, but they always sort of like there was a class element to them. I feel like I think just always process the Replacements more through like like a grit, like you have to like know that they're just like you can't see the Decemberists like going on SNL and just basically fucking up their thing on. They just can't. They're too polished,
No, I wasn't saying that. Right.
No, but I'm just saying, you're right though. Like sonically, they sound like it, and the Hold Steady sound like it, but they're not the fuck ups to replace. And like I think part of what makes the Replacements great is that like they are the fuck ups, and that's why to me their story is Big Star, who was just unlucky, right? They just were unlucky and just never made it work. Whereas Yeah, and I don't think I was just mentioning that because I was just like the more people they brought up, it was just other bands that I just like. Some of them who are more that kind of sound more like them, other ones don't sound like them at all. But like they all share this affinity for them, and we're talking very highly of the very similar things that we've kind of talked about. How they had the edge and the energy, but they also had the sentimentality and the longing and the love. But also they also kept themselves away from. They didn't get too close to any one line, because anytime they got close to one, they would back off and go in a different direction by putting on a really shitty performance. That's the thing. People would say, you go see a show and it could be the most amazing, energetic, like fantastic show you've ever seen, or it could be absolutely terrible. And that's the punk rock in them. That's the punk rock in them. It's like, are you going to get the shitty version or are you going to get the good? And there's an excitement to like which like you're either going to get a story or you're going to get a great show.
Right. Yeah.
Guns N' Roses had that vibe, by the way. Even though they're different, it's the same idea. Like, are you going to get like, and there's a danger to that.
Yeah, the self-destructiveness of the band.
Yeah, and in a more sanitized thing where kind of hip-hop was the only genre that kind of stole that lane in, like, I guess today's day and age, like, you almost forget, like, how danger was such a big part of,
Well, and then there was a part of the Replacements that didn't want to get big. Bob Stinson was like, I don't want to go play an arena. I want to play like this.
Well, they were afraid to get big too.
Yeah.
That's like in the way that like if you grow up working class or poor, right? Like there's a fear of you want to get successful, but you're also terrified of it, right?
Right.
Like
that's and there's like self-sabotage and whatnot. And and speaking of that, so they did release the next album after that. This was Tim in '86, and we're going to cover that in a cold listen. Not too far down the road, but they then were invited to play Saturday Night Live, as John mentioned earlier. At the last minute, they were actually replacing the Pointer Sisters, who weren't able to go on. So I think G.E. Smith was a Replacements fan, and he kind of got them to come on at the last minute, and they got hammered in the green room.
Well, and they were in that weird season, if I remember right, where it was like it was like Anthony Michael Hall.
It was '86. It was like January of early '86 is when it was.
Like Robert Downey Jr. and stuff.
It was the Robert Downey Jr., Anthony Hall, like Michael Hall cast, where people like it's before like the Mike Myers and Dana Carvey like cast came in, and after that all-star team of like Billy Crystal and the guys that do the mockumentaries and Martin Short and stuff.
Right.
And there's like this lost year. So it's like the perfect year for the Replacements to have done SNL too, which also is fantastic about it because
well, they were saying that Stinson's wife was saying that that in the green room they had all
Stinson's this. Or Tommy's?
Bob Stinson's wife. Yeah, that there was a bunch of like bags of groceries and food and stuff like that, and they just took. She's like, and like they just totally trashed the room, like flushing the submarine sandwiches down the toilet, like smearing the brownies on the walls, like taking the bananas out and just mushing them into the couch cushions and stuff, and. So they just got hammered, and then they went on stage, and at one point, Westerberg yelled "fuck" on stage and stuff, So they're one of those few bands. We talked about this a while back, but they did get banned,
right?
They got Fear, Sinead. Who else? Do you remember the other ones?
Rage Against the Machine, right? Didn't they get banned?
Yes, I think that was much later because that wasn't on the list of the documentary that I saw. But yeah, I think that they were on there too. Cypress Hill was on there as well. Did you say Sinead O'Connor? I
did. Yeah.
Yeah, she was another one. But it's shortly a few months after that performance in August of '86, Bob Stinson left the band. The reports kind of differ on whether he quit or whether he was kicked out. But he and Paul Westerberg definitely had their issues with each other, sometimes on stage.
The book based really the famous book that was written, and I'll drop the name in a second here when I pull it up, but pretty much says that like it was alcoholism, and the rest of the band kind of just was like, we just can't do this anymore. So,
it's like when Guns N' Roses kicked out Steven Adler for doing too many drugs. It's like, man, you got to do a lot of drinking to get kicked out of the Replacements. But and then shortly after that, the band fired their manager Jesperson. And the band continued on. They released "Please to Meet Me" in 1987, "Don't Tell a Soul" in '89, and their final album was "All Shook Down" in 1990. Final performance on July 4th of 1991. As for Bob Stinson, he played in some other bands before his untimely death at the age of 35 in 1995. And it's one of those things where he was a lot of people were saying, it was because there was an overdose or of drugs or alcohol, but actually it was the real cause was just organ damage from years of drinking. So there wasn't one incident that caused it. It was just he drank.
It was the leaving Las Vegas death. You know what I mean? Slow suicide by drinking. Yeah,
right. Organ failure. So, so that's really sad. Tommy Stinson played in some other bands, including
GNR.
Yeah, he played Guns N' Roses, bassist in Guns N' Roses from 1998 to 2014. Westerberg did go on to a solo career. He's got a ton of solo albums. And Chris Mars works primarily. He did a couple of solo albums, but he works primarily now as a visual artist.
Right.
And they did reform a few times from 2012 to 2015. Did a couple of live shows. I think they played like a Coachella or Lollapalooza or something like that set. And in 2014, they were nominated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but they were not inducted. So, one of those bands, very influential. Did not sell many records though, even in their re-releases and whatnot. They still
no. And I mean, you left out some of the other great stories, like when they finally got a video on MTV. They basically just did a picture of a stereo system for Bastards of Young and refused to put anything in there. So that's another great Replacement story that they just basically phoned it in to make it as, completely undesirable to watch as possible. Yeah. So,
jeez.
There's other great, there's a bunch of stories of like how they were about to get signed for a major label and then they just purposely played covers that were, borderline offensively bad.
Yeah. They did do a lot of covers. There were some shows that's basically all that they did. And yeah, sometimes it was awesome, sometimes it was terrible, but they were a pretty good covers band when they were on point, from all reports. But John, I was also thinking of watching that documentary, like I remember you saying once something about, I forget which band it was. Maybe it was Goldfinger, but you were like, that band would have been way more popular if they were better looking. And yes. A couple of people talk about, you still look at the Replacements, they're not the most attractive people, but maybe that had something to do with their lack of marketability.
No, there's like an alternative thing, where they're like a much more popular band because they're more handsome. And there's also another lane where they become like REM because they're more professional, that's kind of, so, yeah. But instead they end up in like the Big Star, Badfinger, like pop rock bands that never got as big as you would imagine they should have been. Yeah.